You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and I read the Bible and talk about it and distribute it amongst the peoples of the internet for their own edification. We hope.
Yeah.
How you doing, Em?
Man, I'm learning I need to stay off Facebook is what I'm learning. So, and so when you said that, it's like, can we just like strategically drop some of these episodes on people and say, you have to listen? So,
Well, I don't think it's a good idea to force religion on people.
well, darn it. No, I agree. I do agree. It's just, occasionally I get a little overzealous and like I want to shake people. It's like, why can't you get these principles, these ideas? They're simple.
Yeah, it what was we made the joke one time it'd be a lot what was it? Ministry would be a little bit easier if we could practice it the way house practices medicine.
Right. Well, and the thing is, that's like our natural inclination. That's how we would do it without the love of God. So this is why people need to be happy that God has really, worked with us on being better on that
And is
aspect.
continuing to work with us.
Yes, because we need it.
Yeah,
So
there are many natural inclinations that I have managed, that the Lord has managed to help me keep under control.
well, and I do think, and not to brag on us too much, but there's times that I know I catch myself going, okay, is this too much? And I'll send you a message of what I want to send, or you'll do the same thing with me. And it's like, let's pull it back a little bit.
Yeah, we ask for feedback, get it out of our system, and then
Going to vent to you so that the love of Jesus can be found in my heart again.
and then for some reason after we send it to each other, cutting and pasting it into the other text field just seems like way too much work.
Yeah. So no, I think it's a pretty good system that we've got there. And I think more people would benefit if they had someone else to bounce stuff off of.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter what I send because you're my sibling. It's not like you're going to stop being my friend.
Right, I'm kind of obligated.
You locked into this.
I've got how many 40 years, into this. I can't really get out. Is that mean the time of trial and testing is over? Is that what the 40 years?
Oh man, yeah. I'm coming up on that. Maybe that. Does life get easier after 40 years?
Not in my case. That's when everything went crazy on a different level. So
yeah. So no, I went to the doctor. This was a few months ago, and the nurse is checking me in and doing all the stuff, and she asked how old I am, and I told her I'm 38, and she goes, "Oh yeah, you're due to start breaking down soon." I'm like, "Hey, thanks.
Appreciate that.
Where's that in the manual?" No.
Somebody always there with an encouraging word. Always.
I tell you. Anyhow, well, that's a lot of weird personal stuff. So
It's who we
catch
are.
us. Yeah. So anyway, we should talk about the Bible because that's why people are here, I think.
Yeah, more so than you hearing us talk.
Yeah.
Well, we could start.
Yeah, catch us up.
Well, we'd start talking about how 1 Samuel 21, I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 21 and 2 Samuel 24 play off each other. But before we got there, we wanted to look at how they play off two other stories. And those two other stories are the Akeda, more commonly known among Christians as the binding of Isaac, or at the Exodus, specifically the plague of hail. And so we're going to look at these two stories with those passages in Samuel, and we're going to try to make some sense of how all of this flows together. And then I sat down and I put together this fun recap where I take all four stories 21, 24, Akeda, the plagues, and I brought together their connecting themes And then we'll get to actually looking at 21 and 24 together because that's how big of a geek I am. So, okay,
And
it
if
was a
we're
lot of
here,
fun.
and if you're here, we presume you're at least close to that.
Yeah, I think let's see, I wound up writing 132 pages of notes on this particular thing, so we're probably gonna be here for a while.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so let's begin with the Akeda, and, this story is, very foundational to Judaism as a whole. I mean, this is kind of like the defining moment because this is where Abraham really proves his devotion and commitment to God. It's the beginning of the creation of that sacred family that's going to claim the sacred space. And we've got to remember, since Eden, the story of the Bible is really about reclaiming that sacred space and it's finding that sacred geography. So some people already see where this is going in context with 2 Samuel 24. But the story of Isaac is connected to these passages in Samuel because number one, it's a chiasm. So we have the same structure. Remember that chiastic form is where you have kind of that V where you get the central point, and then the two side branches. As you progress out, they interconnect with the corresponding spot across. And so we have that connection with structure and form, which is not uncommon in the Bible, but it's not super common in the Bible. So then we have the purpose of God's blessing to Abraham through his family was to bless the nations. We find that in Genesis 12:5. And the purpose of the nation of Israel was to bless the nations of the world, Genesis 18:18. So we have that connection. Then if you look at what the king of Israel was supposed to do, he is supposed to fulfill that purpose in a national way. We find that in Isaiah 55, Psalm 145, 45:5, Zechariah 8:20 through 23, Ezekiel 37, 27, and 28, and in conjunction with Samuel 2. So what we find is in Jesus, we have this collation of Abraham's promise and Abraham's purpose, along with the Davidic promise and purpose in him. And we see that explained in Galatians 3:14, which says, so that in Christ the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, that he might receive the promise, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. But we also know that Christ is king. And so all of this kind of plays off of each other, this idea that there's going to be the sacred people that God is going to use not just so that they can be blessed within the excuse the dogs in the background, the blessing can extend into all the world and be available to all people through these sacred people. So it it's a lot of fun when you try to figure out how this works in a grand theme because we don't often talk about this theme as running through the scripture. We talk about the individual stories and we might touch on, kind of some basic elements in the stories that illustrate this, but we don't see it as this ongoing progression that culminates in, Acts 2. And so it becomes something that is not so abstract, but it's actually something that we're involved in, that we get to participate in. So the third point is the central theme of Abraham's story, and it's succession because he already has, first, he started out with not being able to have children. Then he has Ishmael, and God tells him to kick Ishmael out. So the son that he loves, because remember, he really loved Ishmael. We're going to talk about that more later. Um, and he's sent him away. But then, whenever he does receive this child of promise through Sarah, the bride who was included in that covenantal promise of God to Abraham, God says, "Hey, I want you to kill him." And so this theme of succession and who is going to succeed Abraham and how is the promises going to be fulfilled without an heir? This is very much central to Abraham's story. And it's a huge issue in David's story because if he doesn't have a successor, an heir to claim the throne, is he a king? And we've talked about if you don't have that succession, you're not really a king. You're just a warlord. You're in the vein of the judges. It's not that same. You can't create a dynasty with one person. And we've got to remember at this point, Amnon is dead. The child with Bathsheba, the first one, is dead. Absalom, the heir apparent, he's dead. So at this point, who is going to follow David? Now we know about Solomon, and we've had a hint in First Samuel, in Second Samuel previously that Solomon is going to take the throne. But Solomon's very problematic for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that his mother is still referred to and will continue to be referred to as the wife of Uriah. So there's some issue there that is going to have to be overcome. And there's going to be some major tensions in court that when we start talking about when Solomon gets to the throne, what he's going to have to go through to get there and why all that's problematic. Because there is another son, but this is not a son that we've heard anything about. This is not a son who seems to be worthy of the throne. And but this idea of succession, it has huge implications within the New Testament for believers becoming co-heirs with Christ. And it really drives home the point that the central theme of the Bible has always been about the creation of a family. It's always been about being able to have those people who share in a vision and purpose to bless the world.
Hmm.
And I think we forget that. I mean, and why shouldn't we? I mean, when you talk to a lot of Christians and they're discussing theology and they're talking about things that other people should know, there there's not lot of love sometimes presented there. There's not a lot of blessing that's being extended to other people. It's kind of like if you don't believe what I do exactly the way I do, and I'm not talking like, the core themes. I'm not talking about, the virgin birth, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. I'm talking like peripheral issues. Then they can just get ugly. And I'm guilty too. I mean, I'm not gonna say, "Hey, yeah, follow me and do what I do." Don't do that. Do what Jesus did because I'm always gonna screw it up. But the thing is, we are supposed to be a blessing. And so that begins is the roots of that is in that promise to Abraham. The other, connecting theme is numbering. God demonstrates that Abraham's descendants are going to be innumerable. Genesis 13:6, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offsprings can be counted. Well, David's attempting to do just that. He's trying to count the descendants of Abraham, so that's another connecting theme there. Um, the totality or the scope of the promised land, um, after the promise that his descendants cannot be counted is another theme. Abraham is told to walk the length and the breadth of the land that God is going to give him. And it culminates with this altar being built at the Oaks of Mamre. David tells Joab, I want you to go from Dan to Beersheba, from the farthest north to the farthest south. And so essentially the length of the land. And it also culminates with a sacrifice at the threshing floor. So the sixth connecting point are threes. Abraham traveled with Isaac 3 days to get to Mount Moriah. And then we have 3 days of pestilence in the land. And the 3 days in each account are a season of death that end in life, which is really interesting because we often think about life then death, but in the Bible so often that's flipped. You have to go through that death to get to the light. There's no bypassing. So and in each case that process of dying and death, they end on that third day so that life can be renewed because when Abraham took that first step out and he's got Isaac and he's going to um he knows he's going to take Isaac to Mount Moriah to kill him. He's already relinquished control of Isaac. He's basically in his mind said, "Yes, he is dead to me," essentially. And then David, of course, knew that 70,000 men of Israel had died due to the pestilence. So at the end of those 3 days, what's God do? And oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it does end in life. We'll get there. The fourth point is, I think I've got my um, yeah. I
Got,
can't number things.
got your notes
Yeah.
out of order?
No, I got them in order, but I saw 3 days and then I wrote point 4. So anyway, so the next point
Hmm.
is supernatural sight. Abraham sees the ram behind him. David lifts up his eyes. Abraham also lifted up his eyes. and he sees the angel of the Lord at Jerusalem. And then we do find that the angel of the Lord, another connecting point, is present in both of these accounts. We also have obedience and surrender that enable Abraham and David to be delivered out of their situation. Um, then we have Abraham is in the process of offering his son, and David asked that God take his house, his father's house, which encompasses not only David and his brothers and sisters and his mom and dad, it's actually even his own sons. So David actually offers up his sons, is willing to offer up his sons if God will stop killing the people in Israel. And so the thing with this is without the sons, there's no way for God to fulfill his promise. At least not that we can see. You've got to have that successor. Abraham can't be a great nation without a successor. David can't be the king of Israel without a successor. And so you 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 get those connecting themes. In Genesis 22:10, Abraham stretched out his hand, or he reached out his hands. He shalak is the word there in Hebrew. In 22, God says, "Do not stretch out your hand. Do not lay your hand," is what the ESV says. But in 2 Samuel 24:16, the angel of the Lord is the one who stretched out their hand to Jerusalem. It's the same word. And so you have those connecting themes. So, the don't do it, that stopping of laying on the hand, that shalak.
Hmm.
Um, the ram is offered in place of Isaac. The oxen are offered in place of the people of Jerusalem. We have this is the final time that God speaks to Abraham. It's the final time that God speaks to David, which is an interesting point. After the Acadah, Abraham purchases the grave for Sarah, and he purchased it from the Hittites. We talked a little bit about this. He purchased it from the Hittites. The Hittites said, "Hey, wait, you're a prince among us. We aren't going to take any money from you. You just go ahead and take it." And Abraham says, "No, I'm going to buy it." Same thing happens at the threshing floor of the Jebusite. And you know, the decline, um, each man declines the respective offer to be given this piece of land. They actually purchased it. So those are some pretty obvious ties between the stories. I think everybody can kind of see how I got there.
Hmm.
And so immediately when you see those kinds of ties, you have to look at what does this mean and how does this play out. Grab some coffee there. So the Acadah is the defining event in the formation of the Abrahamic family. And as such, it's the defining event in the formation of Israel. And for this reason, it's actually considered to be the last day of creation in Jewish tradition. And we talked about that when we talked about Isaac and Ishmael in our previous episodes. In our passage in Samuel, David's willingness to sacrifice himself, his hopes, the promises that God had given him, are the foundational moments in the creation of the temple and in establishing Israel as a kingdom of priests. If you don't have a temple, where are the priests going to work? David actually he sets in motion that the external elements that allow Israel to be seen as a holy nation. And so he is actually defining Israel as a sacred place, just as Abraham's events defined his people as a sacred people. So the stories parallel each other: holy people, holy place. And so the, like I said, the quest for a sacred space has started with Eden. But our final connection between these stories actually we need to look at Second Chronicles 3:1, and it tells us, "And Solomon began to build the house of the Lord, Jerusalem, on Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared to David, his father, at the place David had appointed on the threshing floor of Oranon the Jebusite." So in Chronicles, specifically, Mount Moriah, the place where Abraham went to offer up Isaac, is said to be the exact same spot where David builds this altar and buys this threshing floor. So we have the connection of geography. They're considered to be the exact same place. Now, given this, I mean, what's really fun, this is where you get into some really great rabbinic stories, and I didn't even have time to, like, go through all of them 'cause they're just really fabulous. Some of them might be reaching a bit, we always have to, kind of use some caution, but the rabbis picked up on this, and they, like, ran with it, and they're like, "Okay, so if this is the place where Abraham offered Isaac, and this is the place where David built a temple, then it also has to be the place of creation. It has to be where Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices. This has gotta be where Noah built his altar after he got off the ark." Um, they also, through some creative, cutting, make this to be Mount Sinai. Basically, the mountain was said to be cut in half and separated to allow there to be 2 mountains that were actually one. Probably didn't happen, but that's how much they wanted to put significance on the spot. And I do see it as the mountain of the Lord in Isaiah 2, which I can actually see that one. I think that probably is. Now, whether or not the rest of the things happen, who knows? I think one of the more fascinating connections that they suggest that this is Bethel, the place where Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending from heaven, or Jacob's ladder. And so there's some who go so far as to claim that the stone where David had laid the altar was actually the stone that Jacob used to rest his head on.
Mhm.
So, there's a whole mythology that's grown out of these traditions, and they're really fascinating.
Yeah, and that's all, just rabbinic tradition and things like that. We don't have any solid evidence on those.
Absolutely. And I think they're fun. I think that they are kind of it's interesting to see what significance they try to attach. And, could some of them be true? Absolutely, some of them could. Are all of them true? No, I doubt it.
Right,
But
well, yeah, it's kinda one of those wouldn't it be really interesting if this all kinda tied together?
yeah.
But it's
Well,
also kind of
and
funny because it's like, it already ties together. We have the words in the
yes. Now, I do want to make it clear. Chronicles makes it very clear that Mount Moriah and this threshing floor purchase were the same site. So we do have that, and that is biblical. That is found in the Word. No problem with that connection right there. But because all these traditions grew up, and we did a whole episode on this before, and I could not find it because I've slept, and I maybe you can help with the episode number about the navel of the world,
Mhm.
and that in this particular spot that there's this divine kind of umbilical cord that connects heaven and earth, and that the heavenly courts are to be mirrored in the earthly courts of the temple, and so people could catch a glimpse, and that anything that kind of happened here essentially had a greater impact of what was going on in the heavens because it was kind of a direct conduit. You didn't have all it was a hard line to the heavens versus, kinda radio signals, if you will. And this idea that if you did something at this spot, that it was going to be heard, felt, whatever, much quicker and much more effectively than any place else in the earth.
Yeah. I
And
found it, by the way, Navel of the Earth. It was
oh,
episode 69.
okay,
Over
there you
100
go. So
over
we
100 episodes ago.
yeah, 100, yeah, I'm not gonna do math. So
That's why I just round things.
yeah, exactly. But I think, as Christians, there's this tendency to kind of like, well, whatever. That's Old Testament. We don't really need to deal with that. We don't need to worry about that. But I actually think there's some like really profound lessons in this for Christians. Um, Not that we take it as scripture, but that just the imagery might be helpful. Because if we stop and to consider who or what the navel of the world, I'm sorry, who or what the third temple is, that's where I was trying to get, then, that's us.
Mhm.
That's who we are, and if things that happen in that sacred space of the temple have a direct line to the heavens, and the things that go on inside the temple, the second temple or the first temple, had such a profound impact because there was that direct line, how much more is the temple that we embody, that we inhabit within these bodies, going to be able to access that kind of heavenly attention? And so I think it's kind of a really great image to understand the importance and the significance of the temple, because so often we don't assign any kind of real value to the temple because we're unfamiliar. I mean, yeah, it was great and it was wonderful and it helped define the nation, but God lived in the temple. God's glory was manifest in the temple.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he didn't live in the temple, but that's where he interacted with people.
Well,
It's
well, then you go back to the ability of God to inhabit one space and still be everywhere, and so that's the fun part because you get to see how God's was so present that people actually were afraid to approach because they knew He was there, and so I I do love that the fact that that building with all this awe and this splendor and this crazy manifestation of God is the imagery that we're given about who we're supposed to be as New Testament believers. And so I think we need to take seriously the teachings about the temple from the perspective of how do I then live my life? How do I live my life as a living, breathing temple to God? And so just going to do a quick plug for Tending Our Nets with Joshua Sherman because he's talking about the image of God, and that's part of that. Is being the temple is also being in the image of God, and so if you want to learn more about that, go check out what Joshua's doing. Now, the one indisputable aspect of the story is what this is just what blows me away is the angel of the Lord stopped Abraham before he kills Isaac. Okay, and the angel of the Lord is standing between heaven and earth with an outstretched sword towards Jerusalem. In both moments, what we have to remember this is the pre incarnate Christ. This is Jesus was actually there participating in the events that would are foreshadowing his own death and resurrection. And so that's just wild to me because when you think about eternal knowledge and the fact that he knew what he was going to endure on the cross, and yet he's still doing, he's actively involved in indisputable ways in these moments where he sees these images, these kind of warnings of what's going to happen to him. And yet he's still right there and he's still faithful to follow through in the gospel. That just actually, to me, that's mind blowing. That it increases that depth of sacrifice because it's not some abstraction for Jesus. By the
Mhm.
time he gets to earth, it is a reality, and I think we forget that, Jesus was not somehow, hanging out in heaven, disconnected to the events leading up to his life, death, and resurrection. He was actually here. He knew what it was going to cost him, and yet he still was actively shaping history to get us to that point where he could join us. It's not God the Father doing it all and Jesus not participating. It is the God, the triune God doing it together. And so
Well,
to
it's
me that go ahead.
it's one of those areas where it clearly illustrates, like you're saying, God manifest and God also. It's one of those things that's really wild to try to think about. Is God being of same substance and different persons and the everything, and I am trying my best to talk about it without slipping into some kind of heretical view because it is such a complex uh way of thinking
It
about it, but here it is illustrated in the retelling of what's going on.
mhm,
Like you said, that's really just that I hadn't looked at the story near like with any kind of scrutiny in the past,
mhm,
but when we
mhm.
read through it last week, I was like, "Oh, wow, this is this is quite the
Right?
event."
Well, and we we tend to try to make well, I don't know if we do it intentionally. I think it's kind of just the fallout of the way we tell the story. God's doing all these horrible things in the Old Testament, and then baby Jesus shows up at the nativity and everything changes. So during the Old Testament, Jesus must have been off doing someplace else. He's just sitting on the sidelines waiting to be, called in by the coach.
Mhm.
But no, he wasn't, and he was actively participating in everything that happened. And this really does away with the idea that somehow, and I've heard this taught, I've seen this on the internet, that Jesus is some kind of helpless victim to God's senseless wrath. And that, he just happened to get caught up and had to follow through if he was going to save us. No, he was part of this plan from the beginning. Everything that happens is something that he helped orchestrate himself. And so, right here, when we see this both with the Akeda and with Jerusalem, it just means that Jesus really meant what he said. He and the Father are one. This was their design together. So we can't make that crazy, weird separation that people like to make, that the Old Testament God was bad, maybe even not the true God, but then the New Testament God is good. That's not how it works. He's either God from the beginning of earth and until the end of time, or he's not God at all.
Right.
That's just the truth. So, so that kind of lines up our connection with the Akeda. Okay, so we see, I think everybody can see those parallels. Now, the other story connected to Second Samuel 24 is Exodus. And it's helpful if we remember back when we study this, that when we talked about Samuel as a whole, way back there, however many episodes ago, that the writer really pulled off of the Exodus to set up kind of his template or formula for how he was presenting this. Samuel was the second Moses. uh, Saul was going to be Pharaoh, and that was kind of the framework that he was working from. And the struggle is to remember all that as we get this far into the book. And so as we look at these two stories together, I think it's going to be a little bit more obvious and why remembering that is important in Second Samuel 24. Because I think for David, the question really um, is the kingship in Israel going to be different than the kingship in Egypt? Is the king of Israel going to be a king for God, or is he going to be like Pharaoh? And I think chapter 24 really asks the question, will David pass the test? Will he be able to separate himself both from Pharaoh, who kind of is the epitome of what a worldly king is supposed to look like at that time, versus Saul, who had failed so miserably, sorry. So the themes are pretty easy to see. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and this makes God an active participant in influencing Pharaoh's intent and action. We're going to go into this a little deeper later. God incites David. Remember, that's verse 1 of 24, to number the people. And we find this word here, incite. We actually come across it previously in 1 Samuel 26:19. And this is David talking to Saul, and he says, "If the Lord has stirred you up against me," that's how the ESV has it, but it's the same word that is translated as incite here.
Mm.
"May he accept an offering, but if it be men, may they be accursed." So what we're presented is not with this inescapable will of God, where God dictates the person's heart and mind in these situations, but rather a circumstance where a person is invited to participate. David says, if God has stirred you up, I can offer a sacrifice. I can make a sacrifice. God will accept it, and we can be okay. So if the person, see if I can make this picture clear. So David's saying Saul is the one who's being incited. Now David can make the sacrifice to God, and God is going to respond, regardless of the fact that Saul has been incited. As a matter of fact, this might actually de-escalate the situation. And so David is saying he gets to decide and determine what's going to happen next because God has given him a way to do it. I'm going to offer a sacrifice. I need to figure out why God has incited you against me, or stirred you up against me. And if you remember back in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 1, God's not mad at David. God's mad at the people. So the people actually had a chance to step forward and say, "Hey, we need to offer a sacrifice. We need to do something to respond to God." Guess what? They didn't do it. And so, um, we have some really interesting possibilities being presented here. Now, we do find the word hardened is included in 2 Samuel 24. Um, it's in verse 4, and you're going to read it in your Bible as, but the king's word prevailed. This is when he's been talking to
To
Joab.
Joab, yeah.
Yeah, and Joab had said, "Why do you do this? Why do you delight in this? Don't do that." And so David, it says the king's word prevailed, but that word prevailed there is kazak, which is to grow firm, strong, or to be hardened. It's the same word applied to Pharaoh. And we are reminded of Moses before Pharaoh attempting to persuade him to release the people. And and it appears to me that the only reason why Joab's story is included, because it's really odd that it is included in the narrative if you think about it, it's a gentle warning. David did have a choice. Just like Pharaoh had a choice when Moses stood in front of him, David had a choice. He could
Mhm.
have stopped this, he could have done something better. He was not forced to do this action. And so, because if you look at the plagues, and this is what most people overlook, and they'll say, "Oh, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is why he did this." If you look at the plagues and you go back to Exodus, now from the first plague, you're going to find that Pharaoh's heart was definitely hardened. But if you notice, God doesn't harden Pharaoh's heart until the sixth plague, and that's the boils. Before that, Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
Mhm.
And basically, God said, He's already shown me what he wants. And I think this boils, because I don't know if you ever had a boil, they hurt. More than one would be absolute misery. I- God said, this is where he's going to crack. I'm not going to let him crack because he's already shown me what he wants. And I'm going to make sure he gets exactly what he wants. Pharaoh made his choice. So a lot of times when you see people proof texting, oh, well, they didn't have a choice because God did this or God did that. If you look back and look up at the events that led to that no choice moment, there was actually choices already being made. David made a choice. Now God actually, God incited, God stirred him up. God said, "Hey, here's something you can do." But it wasn't because he was mad at David, and it was David responding in his own hubris, if you will, of being king, that he decides to do what Pharaoh did, and that is to harden himself against what should be done so he can achieve his purposes. And, we've seen this pattern. All of us know it. With Pharaoh, Moses goes and stands before Pharaoh, says, "Let my people go. Here's what's going to happen." Pharaoh goes, "Yeah, I don't think so." God sends the plague. It's the same thing we see in 2 Samuel 24. And it's interesting to me that God doesn't harden Pharaoh's heart until the sixth plague, and it's not until the seventh that we have this interesting word of pestilence in the form of hail. And then we've talked about that previously, that this word pestilence occurs both in 2 Samuel and in Exodus 9, that plague of hail. It's not an uncommon word. I want to be clear about that. So I'm not saying, "Oh, look, it's only found here." No, it's a very common word in the Bible, but it's only one of two of the plagues that word is used of. And we should note the plague itself is not called pestilence. God says in regards to what he could do, he actually says, "I could have struck you with pestilence. I could have caused pestilence and cut you off." Um, and it's the word that we typically have applied to the plagues, that's translated as plagues, is a completely different word. There's dever, which is pestilence, and nagav, nagaf, sorry, um, as to plague, to strike, to smite. But anyway, it's another interesting point about that particular plague. It's against the flax and the barley harvest.
Mhm.
And that's gonna be important when we get to looking at 21 and 24 together. Now, the pestilence in both Samuel 24 and in Exodus 9 in particular are limited in geography. that the hail went throughout Egypt except for the land of Goshen. The pestilence was sweeping through Israel and stopped at Jerusalem. So we have limited geography. We have this shared hand language. God commands Moses to stretch out his hand, and that's how he instigates or initiates so many of the plagues. And God commands the angel of the Lord to stop his hand, to unclench his fist, is what it says. But the ESV translates that as "stay your hand." Um, because of the speech that God makes prior to this plague, it's seen specifically to be the only plague that's delivered by God's hand. So this plague of hail, because God says, "I could have stretched out my hand and brought pestilence." People think, or the Jewish commentators have said, this is the only one that God actually initiated in an active way through his hand. Um, David and the Pharaoh both say, "Katati, I have sinned." And that's an interesting point. Both the leaders will make this confession. Um, Pharaoh confesses of the sin after the pestilence is struck. David confesses before the pestilence reaches Jerusalem. David repents, and that's sincere. It's lasting. He offers himself up in place. Pharaoh's, of course, his repentance and it is gone the moment he sees the pestilence is gone, or the plague is gone. David saw the angel of the Lord and fell on his face. Pharaoh sees the pestilence, and that's whenever he repents. So, David sees God and repents. I think this is a really cool distinction here. David sees God and repents, in the form of the angel of the Lord. Pharaoh sees the evil and repents. So as soon as the evil is removed, then the repentance goes away. And you that's a huge shift. If you repent because you see the glory and goodness of God, it has an impact. If you repent because you want the bad things to stop or that you just don't want to go to hell, how long does that repentance last? You know, a lot of times when we focus on, oh, don't let that bad thing happen, don't let me go, be punished in any sort of way, that repentance goes away as soon as that threat loses its bite.
That's actually a pretty interesting thing because we have talked a lot about when we reduce the gospel to just your get out of hell free card.
Mhm.
That a lot of times there is a lot of, I mean, and again, you can't. I don't know how to. I know we're getting in some murky waters here with this, but you do have those false repentances or those temporary repentances or however you want to classify them. I don't understand all the mechanics on that. But anyhow, the um but no, that actually makes sense whenever it goes to something you're moving toward, we see that, we see God and what his plan is and then
Mhm,
moving towards it and working with him for his plan into something
mhm,
positive, something greater than ourselves.
mhm.
That's really interesting because you know, people have a natural tendency to work harder when they're working for something greater than just themselves.
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
almost like it was put there on purpose.
yeah. Well, it really. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, think of. I mean, I'm a good example of this. I know several of my friends who are great examples of this. Before you get married, you're just kind of going around paycheck to paycheck, uh,
Buying guitars.
buying, selling instruments, no savings, no real goals. But then you get married and then there's another person in the mix that you're taking care of.
And you
And
care
not
about.
and that you care about and that cares about you and not necessarily that oh you're taking care of them and I'm not you're
Oh,
taking care of each other. Let's
mhm.
we'll put that conversation aside. But
Yeah.
and then you have things that are like, "Oh, well, now I have to think about how my future is going to operate because now I have another person to think about. I can't just up and move to a new city on a whim. No longer do all my possessions fit in one vehicle." Um, um, uh,
Nathan will tell you that story later, folks.
that's a whole nother season of my life. Um, but it's not those things, and then you're like, and then you also have especially for guys, women have this thing that they want to do called having children a lot of times. And I know I'm probably treading, someone's going to think I'm a terrible sexist. But there's a time limit on that.
You weren't
And
opposed to the
I
idea.
was not opposed to the idea, but I had no idea that it was a reality until after I got married. Then you start thinking about these things that are running around your house, and you got to take care of them. And then it when you're working for something that's bigger than yourself. My point is, uh, you tend to stick to it longer. And that's why I think it's ridiculous that when we reduce the gospel to, hey, this is how you get yourself out of hell,
Mhm.
then we're not challenging people to become part of something greater. It's
Right.
very self-centered. And now I believe there are people who came to Christ with that message, who got
Mhm.
to studying and looking and just absolutely fell in love with God and his kingdom and his people. And I think that I think that works, but I also think when we continue to just reduce it to that, because I've been in I've been in churches where the message was, come to Jesus, get yourself saved from hell,
Turn or burn.
and then once you're, welcome to Christianity, take a seat, Jesus will be back at some point. That's
Right.
there's nothing else to do. It's just God's waiting room, basically, is
Well,
what the church becomes.
and then all you have to do is discredit the Bible. All you've got to do is say, "Oh, well, hell's not real." And now why do I have to listen to any of the Bible? I mean, if that was my only reason for being there, it is hell. When I say being there, being in church, being part of the covenant community is because I didn't want to go to hell, then it's so easy to pull people out of the Christian community away from faith because if they're just there for a threat and the threat's lost its teeth, why are they there? I mean, if they haven't been introduced to the wonders and the amazement that is God, and is whatever level we can get to understand that in this human life, then why? Why? It's I think we forget that people don't need another baseball bat over the head. We got enough of those in this world.
Mhm.
Why can't we present a God who actually loves us? And so I say that as I get ready to talk about, some of the other situations. And because I do, and I don't want to get stuck on this because I'm still working through this and I don't have the vocabulary for all of it to present a cohesive statement right now. But this idea of balancing God's holiness and God's love, that the tension between his justice and his mercy, those are really big topics and those are really hard things to try to explain. But a lot of times when we're looking at these horrible events in the Old Testament, what we're looking at are displays of God's mercy, judgment, but you're always going to find those pockets of mercy in there. You're going to find, displays of God's holiness, but you're going to see these great expressions of love, and
Mhm.
you have to be
Mhm.
able to look at the whole picture to get there. And so that's kind of where we're getting with here, because man, as I studied these two stories, 21 and 24 in Second Samuel, it wasn't until at 1 o'clock this morning it finally hit me exactly how amazing these two stories are when placed together. But we're only on page 100 of my notes, and so we still got a ways to get there. And if I had to struggle that long to get there, I'm going to make y'all fight with me.
Well,
So,
yeah, I do have another question.
oh
Uh,
no.
is,
Okay.
is there any and I know you probably don't know the answer, but I think it would be curious to look into. Is there any other theophanies of uh, in Jerusalem recorded before the birth of Christ?
That would be really interesting to look into. I don't know the answer right off, but, uh, yes, we do have some, and I I'm thinking of a couple now, but I've got 'em jumbled in my head, so we will have to come back to that, and I'm sure we'll get back to that when we get into Kings.
Great,
So
I'm all for
yeah, so
it.
I'm just gonna, stay there. Okay, so basically what we got 2 kings. We got Pharaoh, we got David. They're in the same pretty much exact situation. In 2 Samuel 24:1, God's angry at the people of Israel. This is why he has hardened David's, or why David's heart has been hardened, why he's incited David. Now, one of the things that has confused me ever since I was a kid was why in the world did God let the children of Israel be made slaves in Egypt? You know, I was never given a great answer to that. And we did talk about in our previous episode how Joseph actually wound up enslaving Egypt before all this happened. If you want to go listen to that episode, that's fun. But listen to what Ezekiel says. Listen to what he says about why the children of Israel had to become slaves in Egypt. This is Ezekiel 20, verses 7 through 8. And I said, this is God. I said to them, cast away the detestable things your eyes feast on, every one of you, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. None of them cast away the detestable things their eyes feasted on, nor did they forsake the gods of Egypt. Then I said, I will pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. And then Ezekiel goes on to recount the events of the Exodus that follow God expending his wrath on the children of Israel in Egypt. So again, both kings, same situation. God's mad at the people of Israel. This is why this is going on. And just blew my mind that it's like when I found this, because I hadn't really paid
It's
attention
so
to it. I've
clearly
read it.
spelled out.
Yeah. Well, and I know I've read it, but I never put it together. Because Ezekiel's been one of those books that's fascinated me forever.
It's a weird book.
Uh, it really is. Hence why we're not going to do a book study. Heiser got that covered.
I say
Uh,
Dr. Heiser did one that was pretty good, and I don't know if we can do any better.
So then we have kings who begin a course of action. They harden, they prevail. The Hebrew word, like I said, kazak, under the influence of God's direction and involvement. We've got that laid out pretty quickly. We have that confession of sin, but the outcome is completely different because only David's repentance was sincere. And so this is when David is shown to be greater than Pharaoh. And Pharaoh couldn't sacrifice himself for the people. He couldn't protect the people under his own care. David sees the devastation that's heading towards Jerusalem, and he just throws himself in front of that bus, so to speak, because he wants to protect and defend. He gets it. So that kind of gives us kind of an overview of those two stories. And then this is where things get really, really fun because we have the four passages playing together. We got 2 Samuel 21, 2 Samuel 24. We have the Akeda. We have the plagues of Egypt. So I'm going to start with connecting themes because I want people to see how these they do fit. So first of all, we got supernatural famine. 3 years of famine in David's reign in 21 and 2024. It's offered as an option. In Exodus 9, the famine is caused. Why? Because there's a hailstorm when the barley is in ear, is what it says. Now, not as obvious is with the Akeda. Where's the famine there, right? This is a good question. I'm glad you asked. If we look back to the story just prior, we find out that Abraham is hanging out with Abimelech. He is actually in the region of Gerar. Why do you go to Gerar? You go to Gerar because there's wells there. You go to Gerar because it's a fertile place. So you pick up and you leave where you were. Why? Because there's no food. That's what you do when you're a nomad. So not as clearly spelled out, maybe not famine, but definitely a scarcity of food that would have caused that kind of move. Now, and we need to remember this scarcity of food has Abraham living with the Philistines, which also connects us to David's story because he lived with the Philistines, but that's kind of an aside. We have divine revelation and direction. So David seeks the face of the Lord. That's in 21. David confesses to God, and God reveals the possible consequences. That's in 24. Moses before Pharaoh. You've got the prophet, just like Gad, coming back. And then we've got God talking to Abraham directly, go kill Isaac. So we have divine direction right there. We have guilt revealed. We've got Saul's guilt with the Gibeonites revealed in chapter 21. David's guilt in the census in 24. We have Abraham's, the way he valued his sons is revealed through the Akeda. Remember, he grieved when God said, send Ishmael out. The only son he prays for is Ishmael. He was displeased when he sent Ishmael out. And so we see how Abraham had elevated the Egyptian son above this child of promise through Sarah. So that's a form of guilt. Pharaoh refuses to release the people and is exalting himself. So God reveals Pharaoh's guilt in that. We have the connecting themes of slavery. Who were the Gibeonites? They had been enslaved under Joshua. So that's chapter 21. David numbering the people. We talked about how most likely that was for forced labor. Remember, we talked about we had that new guy in David's administration in the list of the court officials that his particular position was over forced labor. Hagar was Sarah's Egyptian slave. And then we have Israel, of course, enslaved in Egypt. So again, all the stories. Um, Obligations to those who are under someone's rule or leadership. Find those in all four stories. We got Saul's obligation to the Gibeonites as sojourners in the land of Israel. Guess what? They were supposed to get great treatment. That's in the Torah. We've talked about that before.
Hmm.
It's his actions are not excused for it says that he did this in his zeal for Israel and Judah. David accepts the guilt of the people. And we're going to talk more about that. The people were guilty of something. We're not told what it was, but David has an obligation to step up and do something about that as their king. Abraham casting Hagar and Ishmael out with little to no provision. We talked about that. Why didn't he send them out with, some men, some camels, got them to a place where they could exist instead of just leaving them in the desert? He had the ways to do that. He had an obligation as their protector to do better. And then, of course, Saul's refuse.
And as the
Pharaoh.
father of the child,
Right. Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
that too. You assume father protector. It all fits.
sorry.
But yeah, but then Pharaoh, who had, the Pharaoh before had invited these people to come live in Egypt. Why? So that they would survive. And now this Pharaoh says, no, I no longer have to observe the laws of hospitality. We have God's supernatural intervention for those who have been wronged. God sends a famine on behalf of the Gibeonites, not the Israelites, which I think is really interesting, but on behalf of the Gibeonites because Israel had wronged them. Um, God saves Hagar and Ishmael. Remember, the angel shows up. First time we see an angel outside of the Garden of Eden, which is so cool. It's to this woman who's been cast away and who's a foreigner.
Mhm.
And God shows up. Who shows up? The angel of the Lord specifically. Um, then we see God sending the plagues, specifically the rain and hail. These are, again, supernatural revelation. In Samuel 24, in 2 Samuel 24, we do have a deviation. This is where we see how big of a nerd I really am. So, God gave David three choices.
Mhm.
You got the 3 days, the 3 months, the 3 years, pestilence, flight, or famine. But and we still have that question: who is the party? Who's the party that God's going to intervene on behalf of? Because God's anger had been kindled against Israel, but then David messes up with the census. God specifically says, "I'm going to do these things to David," and David says, "I have sinned; I've done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done?" And so the consequence of this action is the deaths of tens of thousands of people, not against David himself. And so we're going to get into why that's important. Bear with me. But we have another deviation in that the supernatural intervention occurs. In the other three interventions, it's all centered on water. The famines, the plagues, it all has something to do with water, yet none of the three things that happen with David, well, aside from the famine, sorry, the famine is centered on water, but what David chooses is not centered on water, or at least it doesn't. And so that really kind of got me, it doesn't appear to, it got my brain going, okay? And evidently got going too fast because now I can't even talk. um, in Exodus 9, the hail is offered in alternative to the pestilence. It's what happens instead of pestilence. God says, I could have struck you with pestilence, wiped you off the face of the earth. And
Mhm.
then he sends the hail. So the hail becomes a substitute. And so I began to wonder, what exactly is this thing we call pestilence? And so I began looking at if the Bible ever actually described what pestilence was. And I began looking at what we know about it. Okay, so we know it works fast. In 3 days, 70,000 people dead, men at least, 70,000 people, men dead. Um, God says that pestilence would have completely annihilated Egypt. Okay, so it's deadly. It's distinct, but often linked with famine, sword, caterpillars, mold, and mildew. So there is a connection aside from the sword with things that we do connect with water. And yes, we do connect caterpillars with water because if you've ever been in Oklahoma in a dry summer, all you're going to find are bagworms all over our trees. They do play off each other. Um, it pestilence almost always comes from God, or you need God's protection from it. God is involved in one way or the other. Amos 4:10 offers an interesting bit of information. Pestilence stinks. He says, I sent among you a pestilence after the manner of Egypt and carried away your horses, and I made the stench of your camp go up into your nostrils, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. So now, I mean, I'm thinking this sounds like something like cholera. I mean, if you look at what cholera does, I mean, it's acute diarrhea. It's awful. I won't even go into specifics, but you can find it online. I did. This is the beginnings of a stinky camp. Weak people with explosive diarrhea who can't get outside the camp to take care of this issue, who are you just at the mercy of their bowels. There's vomiting, there's muscle spasms. There's so much that goes into it. It can kill in a matter of hours if it's left untreated. The treatment for cholera is antibiotics and IV fluids. Not too many of those running around during the Bible times. It's seasonal, actually. We know in countries that deal with this frequently, the rainfall has absolutely every bearing on whether or not it happens. Cholera is waterborne. The primary cause is insufficient sanitation. And so if you are in the midst of a drought, what's the first thing you stop using water for? It's cleaning. You're saving every bit of that to drink.
Makes sense.
And so, yeah, it's just but this means that what you do have is probably contaminated. If you care for someone who has cholera, what do? You wash your hands. Do you think people in the desert are going to be washing their hands with a commodity that's so precious in the middle of a drought? So the pestilence, I think, is still very much connected to the water. So I think that's another connection. Um, and like I said, most of the time, when do we find pestilence? It's linked with famine. So the idea of not having enough water. Now, of course, the other obvious connection, this is death, and it's death enacted and death diverted. David hands the sons of Saul over to be killed. Um, that's the death enacted. The death diverted is the famine stops. Lives are saved. 70,000 men die under the pestilence, but Jerusalem is saved. Isaac is offered up, but then Isaac is saved.
Mhm.
And anyone who listened to Moses and brought their livestock in before that plague of hail, their livestock was saved. Everyone else died. The land of Goshen, saved. So that's the beginning of the connections that we have between these stories. And that was number 7. I have 10 more that we're going to look at before we're done, but I see we're starting to go over time. And to me, it's just this is the stuff that I love. It's finding those connections, and this is where I mean, I had to stop myself at some point. These are just what I see as kind of big glaring, neon signs flashing. This is look at us together.
Mhm.
We're in unison. And I'm sure that if someone sat down and actually went over this with a fine-tooth comb, they would find more connections and deeper connections. But I think what I've got is actually going to demonstrate quite well why these stories need to be put together in our mind and understanding whenever we're reading uh, 2 Samuel 21 and 24. Because when you've got all this background and this context that informs how you read Samuel, now all of a sudden Samuel is going to make sense, but you aren't going to need all that prompting. And the person who wrote Samuel expected his audience to know these stories. These stories would have been taught with every feast and festival.
Mhm.
These would have been part of their day-to-day talks. This is not just their national identity. This is their individual identity. And this is very core to who these people are. So, maybe we need to integrate some of these stories into the core of who we are and our personal identity. So, just a thought.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that was a very dense episode. Um, it was good. It's just a lot of information to take in, so I have to
we got
run.
more next week.
Yeah. Well, the good news is I get to listen to it a couple more times while I edit. So,
There you go.
anyway, but no, that's kind of I wish we didn't have to take a break because it does seem like a lot of this needs to fit together. But you can
It
always
is
run
what
it
it
back
is.
again if you have to go over it before we get to the next thing.
Listen to me stumble again.
Yeah, and if you have any questions about it, comments, anything like that, hit us up on the website, ravencreeksc.com or Raven Creek SC on the website. No, ravencreeksc.com is the website, Raven Creek SC on the social media. I think I said the same thing twice, and 3 times now. But yeah, so find us
Put
there.
this in somewhere on their computer. We'll come up.
Look, yeah, if you Google Raven Creek Social Club, you should be able to find us. There's
Faith and Other Oddities.
Faith and
Yeah.
Other Oddities. Yeah, you're going to find us there, and we're curious to hear what people have to say. Come be part of the conversation, and we will have another show for you, Lord willing, next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.
This is the Open Wallet Podcast, an exploration of personal finance. I'm Katie, a numbers nerd.
And I'm Joe, a 40-year-old punk rocker.
And we're married.
We're here to talk about and figure out all the personal finance questions we all deal with, like,
How do I read my pay stub?
how do I dress better on a budget?
How do I start an emergency fund?
What goes into buying a house?
And lots more.
So join us on Open Wallet Podcast, on iTunes or wherever you find podcasts.